Nurses, what's your worst work-related story? Not mine, but my mom was a night shift ER nurse before I was born, and this is what she told me was one of her worst, but in a long and convoluted way. So one night, they bring in this dude on something. They don't know what exactly, but he's going buck wild. They leave him restrained and alone in one area of the hospital to work the substance out and hopefully be manageable by dawn. Eventually, my mom goes on a break to eat because it's been a slow night and she was hungry. She got her food out of the break room in the area of the hospital the previously mentioned guy was and eats in there. Eventually, she smells something burning, and goes outside to check on what it is. Turns out the guy had a lighter he wiggled out of his pocket and began to burn off the restraints. She knows she can't stop him at this point, so she runs to the doors to alert security. In some twisted horror movie series of events, the doors are locked up, but she sees someone at a desk on the other side. Too late, the man's now freed himself and is going to start chasing my mom. So she outruns him and manages to knock on the door once she makes a lap around the area. Not having enough time to get help this lap, she runs off again, still being pursued by the guy she's locked up with. Third time's a charm. She's far enough ahead of him and the doors are unlocked and ready for her. By this point, the cops have already arrived and 2 officers go through the doors to restrain him and take him in. The third talks to her and comforts her. That officer was the man she later marries and has a child with. Eventually, she also later divorces him, but still considers it a great night because it leads to the existence of her child, me. In another timeline, we could probably presume that the crazy man in his mom's story is actually her son from the future, making sure his parents get together, and what she saw was the effects of time travel. I know, crazy, but the story is crazy too. So let's go ahead and keep on moving forward to the rest of the stories that are probably just as crazy, if not crazier. Let's go. Story 2. Tough to choose, honestly. A couple of years ago, I took care of a long-haul trucker who developed a wound on the underside of his jewels. The vibration of the truck seat wore away at his jewels, and he developed an infected ulcer. As you can imagine, this makes for a very fragile situation. One day, we were helping him out of bed when his jewels became wide open. A bad day for all involved. Also worth a mention, I've seen multiple patients come in with nasty things in their wounds. How does an infestation in your body go unnoticed? And for fun, the one time I had a patient fresh out of open heart surgery try to escape through the toilet. He was having DTs and withdrawals from a variety of street substances. Found him knee-deep in the toilet trying to swim out because he loves a smack. 4 security guards couldn't hold him, even with chest tubes, Foley, the whole works. Don't do substance, kids, but if you do, please tell us which ones. Also, please be straight with us when we ask you how much you drink. Early front-loading with benzos makes your time easier, which makes our time easier. Story 3. To be honest, the real worst stories most nurses don't like to talk about. But here's a pretty awful case that is definitely up there in the category of unfortunate souls. So this poor lady we had who was constantly coming in with sepsis, she had abdominal surgery and developed a fistula, which is basically a hole where there shouldn't be one. Every time they tried to fix them, she developed more. She had a colostomy bag, but she had also developed numerous fistulas all over her abdomen. We had an extensive abdominal dressing regimen where we actually put colostomy bags over a lot of the holes. The whole deal took about 2 nurses about an hour to an hour and a half, and no one wanted her twice because she was really needy, whiny, and mean. Plus, she was on MRSA precautions, so you had to be a grown-up every time you went into her room. We changed her dressing 2 to 3 times per shift. It was awful. And even though she was a really difficult patient, we obviously felt bad for her. She was in her 50s. She's now gone. The cause was actually unknown. She did not have a hernia mesh and she did not have Crohn's disease. I don't remember the original surgery as this was almost 3 years ago now, but I do remember the doctors had no idea why every time they attempted to fix the fistulas, they got worse and she formed more. It was very sad. She probably would not have chosen to end it all as she was very afraid of passing away and still very much in the denial stage up until the end. Story 4. Anything involving critters, unless we put them there on purpose. Had a drive and dump that got admitted. Lady of the night based on clothing choices. Had roaches, just 3, but any is too many. God loves my tech, she just stomped on them and made fun of me. Got my arm stuck between a patient's cheeks while inserting a management system for a C. diff management. I weighed in at about 150 pounds at the time. He was 400 plus. He clenched and was screaming at me to get out. Happened years ago and still gets brought up. Had a patient who had a sacral decub that was huge. My head would have fit in there, no hyperbole. She lived through that for months, plus she was demented, deaf, blind, on dialysis, had AKAs to her hips, and had bilateral removal to her elbows. Constantly begged Jesus to just let her end. Her daughter had POA and just wouldn't change the code status. Story 5. Not a nurse, but a medical assistant. Was my first day on the job at an urgent care, and I was asked to assist with drainage. I said, sure. I walk into the room. The patient is laying on the bed with her legs in stirrups. NBD just assumed the abscess was on her inner thigh, maybe. Wrong. She had two, one on each side of her region, each about the size of dates. So the doctor gets into the first one. Now, usually with those, you get it open and stuff drains out. This one, though, she got it open and it was green fluid. The smell was so terrible, but I could not react as the patient could see my face, and I didn't want to embarrass her any more than she already was, having them drained and all. When it slowed down, the doctor started pulling on it. After packing them, I had to bandage her up. After the patient left, I was congratulated by my coworkers for keeping composure, especially for it having been the first procedure on my first day. I love that job and I miss it every day. I don't really miss the craziness that made my job interesting and fun, though. Story 6. I'll go with a sad one. A 32-year-old male had a bad motorcycle accident and was in our trauma ICU for over a month. Barely made it and was somewhat miraculous. He ended up with a tracheostomy but was on his way to being able to discharge to rehab. I had taken care of him for 3 days in a row, and the last day, late in the shift, he stood up and coughed really hard. We were getting him back to bed from the chair, and all of a sudden red liquid started spurting out. We got him in bed quickly, and within a minute or so, he started coding, cardiac arrest. We call for trauma and ENT surgeons and start mass transfusing samples while coding him, family screaming and being escorted out. Slipping on the floor while we were trying to keep coding, holding pressure on his neck because we didn't know what else to do. One nurse says, she thinks he stopped. He did. We finally called it after about 45 minutes. He had a tracheoarterial fistula which burst, artery around the tract that was worn down by the pressure inside the tract cuff, from a combination of persistent hypertension and strong cough and bad luck. This happens in 0.7% of all tracts. Nurses were sitting on the floor crying, and same with the MDs. It was a bad night and a bad couple of weeks following. Story 7. The worst smelling thing was a homeless man who came in with what looked like moon boots on his feet, except they were surgical boots that he placed foam around and duct tape. They hadn't been removed for about 3 months. He was also diabetic and had ulcers on his feet. We had to take them off to be able to see what was happening. The smell permeated the entire emergency floor. He was yelling down the hall and rude to everyone but me and would only let me take care of him. He ended up refusing care and insisted that we tape his shoes back on and let him leave. Management finally said we could and we sent him off. Saddest stories are the kids. One was harmed by a drive-by and was being coded by the time she arrived. She didn't make it, and hearing the mother hear the news and the screaming from down the hall will stick with me forever. Happy story, a guy out drinking with friends and they accidentally ran him over. We thought he had no brain activity and was going to be a donor. He was transferred from another hospital. We ran some tests and he's able to squeeze fingers and respond to some. He went to surgery and then ICU and was discharged a week later, and his mom found me one day before he left, and I was so relieved for the family. Story 8. Gross one was during nursing school. We had a group watching a doctor replace a gastric tube that had become clogged. Well, even though I was farthest away of the 15 students observing, I was hit by this. The doctor pulled it out and it flung all the way across the room to where I was standing next to the door. I had to stop clinical and go to employee health office to get checked out and have my eyes flushed. Not as bad, but it was the only time so far that the smell really got to me. I had a patient tell me she was clogged back there, but she had dementia and I just hadn't checked her out yet. It was on my list of to-dos, but she wanted to try going to the bathroom. Well, a few minutes after her being on the commode, we walked into her. We make her stop and have her lay in the bed so I can instead do it for her. I was 6.5 months pregnant and started dry heaving nonstop. Luckily, a coworker popped her head in and offered to finish for me. Sadly, she passed away about 2 weeks later. Story 9. Prisoner patient got mad at his cellmate, so mad that he took a weapon to his own jewels. He decided to turn this into a kangaroo pouch and try to put a travel-sized toothbrush into it. Mental health is a real thing, so I guess it's not worst for me as it was for him. Bonus story, car rolls up and dumps out a girl, immediate surgery, she didn't make it and they caught the people who dumped her. But yeah, seeing the cruelty of humanity is the worst. Bonus story number 2. A lady came in via ambulance with a seat cushion stuck to her backside. She had made a mess to herself at home and had no one to care for her. She did this for over 2 weeks before someone called Adult Protective Services. She had to have surgery to remove the cushion. Absolutely terrible. Story 10. A man was discharged from a mental health facility a few days prior. He went home and built a weapon in his garage out of pipes. He proceeded to end himself. His wife called EMS. He was talking when he came into the ED. He asked for water because he was thirsty. This is usually the first sign someone isn't going to make it. The CT scan showed there was a projectile in the heart. He was rushed into my OR. The trauma surgeon split them and was feeling around for where the projectile went. Meanwhile, the front desk is trying to get a hold of the cardiovascular surgeon on call. He's out of town and says to call one of his partners. The first partner is also out of town. The second and third are both an hour away at other hospitals. The trauma surgeon finds a hole in the left ventricle. I'm able to get a hold of another surgeon who isn't on call but is 20 minutes away. He says the patients need to get on bypass if there's any chance, but he'll probably end up passing away anyway. Anesthesia is on a massive transfusion protocol, but his vitals are not improving. The surgeon opens the pericardium, and it sounds like a water balloon hitting the pavement. In an instant, a litter of crimson-colored liquid pours out of the drapes and onto the floor. Anesthesia calls out there's no pulse. Another liter and a half pour from the drapes. We now know where all the liquid went. The next 2 hours include filling out paperwork and calling the medical examiner. I have to speak to the widow and his mother about signing the forms for the ME. His passing will have to be investigated by the county. I still have to get the meat wagon from the morgue and put him on ice. My shift ended 3 hours prior, but it's my passing in my OR, so I'm responsible for all the details and the permits. This one isn't as emotionally tough as the kid who crashed on a coworker's potty. He was declared gone the next morning. The staff lined the halls for an honor walk as his bed rolled by to the OR for an organ procurement. As a father of 2 young boys myself, I broke down and cried as the mother said goodbye. She adjusted his blanket to keep him warm and kept telling him, "It'll be okay. I'll see you later. It'll be okay." Story 11. Doc here, not nurse. Probably resuscitation efforts on a 20-year-old who passed away of diabetes. All I could think about was that he had clearly just got a haircut for the new term at uni as I did CPR. The other was another diabetic chap, 64 years old, who'd already lost one leg and had been putting off removal of the other. He came in profoundly unwell with a white cold foot. I spent 10 hours overnight trying to stabilize him for transfer to a hospital where they could remove it. I couldn't. He was too unwell. I asked him multiple times to let me call a friend, no family for him, but he declined. Intensive care declined to take him. In the morning, we told him we weren't going to be able to do anything for him, and he kept saying, "So then what's next?" The conversation was excruciating. He wasn't getting it. Eventually, the consultant said, "You're going to slip away." The patient said, "I'm going to pass away?" And the fear in his eyes made me want to retch. He then quietly asked me to call his friend and passed away 5 hours later. Happy story, 98-year-old man comes in with terrible heart rhythm, VT, and dropping pressure. Had a DNAR, and daughter said he wouldn't want to have cardioversion, electric shock paddles thing you'll have seen on TV. He's conscious and awake, and I'm giving him a medicine that might work, might not. I ask him what he needs, and he looks at me with a single tear coming from his eye and says, "I know I'm passing away." In that case, I say, "What do you need?" He wanted a sip of drink. This is at 4 a.m. We managed to get him his beverage. He took a sip, closed his eyes, and his heart went back into sinus rhythm, and he was saved. Story 12. Had a nice older gentleman patient who is tachycardic, but all his labs were normal. He seemed like he took fairly good care of himself, was a little disheveled, but he dressed nice and had nice shoes. We initially couldn't find anything wrong with him, but he had a peculiar odor to him that seasoned nurses would get suspicious of. I asked him if he had any infections on his body that he knew of, and he said no, but I wanted to do a thorough check, so we took off all his clothes and he was fine until I got down to his feet. He was wearing an old pair of socks, and as I peeled, the wound odor was so strong. I knew then that his feet were the source. He probably hadn't changed his socks in several months. He ended up being admitted and given lots of antibiotics and wound care. The memory of pulling down his socks will haunt me forever. I guess let it breathe is not just advice for your lungs, huh? Story 13. So many. One very old lady was admitted from her home where her family was caring for her. I took off her shoes because I needed to do an assessment. Next, I took off her sock and something fell off. Thank God I had gloves on. The family said they hadn't taken off her socks in over 2 months. Poor thing passed away 12 hours later from sepsis. Big surprise. So much mess. Now I'm all for wanting patients to make a mess so they don't get constipated. But sometimes staff joke around that they hope their patients have a big BM 10 minutes after they leave their shift. People still pass away from preventable bowel obstructions. Sometimes when milk of magnesia, suppositories, or enemas just won't work, you literally have to go in and after it and remove the brick or pieces of it to get it started. So fun. I don't mind red liquid, but discharge smells nasty. One of the worst smells ever was a patient who had a brain shunt and also a nephrostomy tube, so when we'd empty the drainage bag, it was whiz and cerebral spinal fluid mixed together. That one was about 23 years ago because I remember I was pregnant and I was hypersensitive to smells. Luckily, my coworker did me a solid by emptying and measuring it. I took care of the person otherwise, but couldn't stand to do that one minute task. Story 14. I was a nurse for 25 years, mostly SICU, RR, orthopedics, neurochemical dependency treatment, and as a float. I have way too many stories as well. When I worked at the Bexar County Hospital, it's called something else now, SICU, RR, there was a farmer who had his legs and Johnson pulled when he fell into some sort of thresher. He never lost consciousness until he went to surgery and rarely asked for pain meds. Calm, collected, and motivated to move on the entire time he was on the unit and afterward. One of the most stoic and brave persons I've ever met. He and his wife would bring us food a few times a year. The night a butane truck had an accident in Eagle Pass, we had to move out the entire unit to intermediate in order to receive 9 badly injured people. 7 were gone within a few days. Another one passed away after about 2 weeks. The boy had bad 2nd and 3rd degree burns. Debridement was terrible agony. He fought and fought for 2 months despite the horrible pain. But one day he told the doctor, "I give up," and he passed away a few days after that. He refused to cooperate with treatment, eat anything, or even say anything. I think he willed himself to pass away. That one has really stuck with me through the years. His name was Manuel. I watched way too many young people, not much younger than me at the time, end in truly horrible ways. There were so many horrible things, and it was constant. So much unrelenting, one form or another. Accidents, MVAs, GSWs, partners mistreated so badly and needed surgery and extensive care. It went on, night after night. I stayed there for a little under 7 years and finally fried. A quick pro tip to pass along before I go cry into a pillow after dredging some of this up. Avoid diabetes at all costs if you don't wish to suffer and end horribly if you don't control it. Even when you do, it's still so debilitating. Watch your weight and sugar and carb intake, exercise. And if you're enjoying the video and getting some good tips here, please don't forget to hit that subscribe and like button for more videos just like this. Story 15. I'm not a nurse, but I worked in X-ray and I've seen a lot of crazy hospital moments. There was an elderly patient passing away from a septic bowel. Unfortunately, due to overcrowding, there were no private rooms available to contain their last moments, so we had to smell them for hours. I never wanted to know what it smelled like, but now I do. I was asked to do a portable chest X-ray in the ER. A lady was found down at the scene of a car accident. I'm standing over her, trying to line up my X-ray machine, and all I can see is these big globs of adipose hanging. Years ago, I was working Christmas Eve. I had a patient come in with his wife, not very old, around their 50s, complaining of minor chest pain. He was placed in the bed area reserved for patients who are not that serious, but having a bed would make them more comfortable. He had no problems coming over in a wheelchair for a chest X-ray. We chatted about Christmas plans, seemed in good spirits, just slightly concerned. A few hours later, around 2 a.m., he takes a sudden severe turn for the worst. They immediately move him in a trauma bay, start chest compressions, and shock him. His wife was asked to wait outside while this was all going on. Despite their best efforts, the ER staff were unable to bring him back. The ER doctor had to cry before she collected herself enough to tell the wife. This hospital is in a rural area, and while the ER team was trying their best, myself and the unit clerk were trying to find any sort of person to provide support for the wife. But she had no family in the area, and none of the religious groups in the area were answering their phones. I just kept thinking of this poor woman and how they probably had Christmas gifts for each other under some tree, and instead he passed away in the wee hours of Christmas morning, leaving her all alone. Story 16. Not a nurse, but this reminds me of what happened to my mom last year. She's a caregiver, so not really a nurse, but still helps out with injured and elderly people. She had this one person that was really nice and she liked, but Alzheimer's was starting to take its toll on her mind. She and my mom got along well and bonded over their love of the show Bones, which they often watched together. After a while, she started to forget or confuse things and get really upset about them. My mom voiced her concerns about the declining mental health of someone she considered somewhat of a friend to her children, but they wouldn't listen and said things like, "Oh, she's always been forgetful." Her employers wouldn't listen either because as long as she or her children who were paying weren't complaining, then it was still something they could handle or whatever. One night, things finally escalated when she just completely freaked out and did not recognize who my mom was at all. She started screaming all these really cruel, slightly prejudiced things and telling her to get out of her home and that she was calling the cops. My mom went outside and followed company policy for such incidents, which involved calling the family and them and informing them of the situation. The cops came and my mom explained the situation to them, which thankfully they were really understanding about, and the whole thing was eventually worked out. After that, the children finally decided it was time to get her to a round-the-clock care facility with licensed professionals. It really did shake my mom, though, because she got along so great with her, and to see her just completely not recognize her and berate her was really shocking. It also worried her in case that could be her in the future because it does run in her side of the family, which is definitely a scary thought. Story 17. Not a nurse, but am a medical scribe. Most recently, we had a baby be rushed in from POV after an apparent dog incident. The kid was ill-fed. His parents and grandparents have moved to 4 different states since he was born. Well, that day, the mother decided to leave the child in a pack-and-play unattended with multiple large husky mixed dogs. He wasn't even in an actual house. They said it was more like a shed or outbuilding. She had walked next door to her grandmother's house for around 30 minutes. Upon returning, she found the patient with one of the dogs. After being rushed into the ED, we got him as stabilized as we could, and we had to transfer him a good hour or 2 down the road for surgery. The father went home to try and harm the dog. By the time he had gotten back to the house, the dog was already missing. As sad and horrible as it is, that dog may have ended up saving that kid's life. There is no way he will be going home with his parents, and he will hopefully make a full recovery and be taken in by much more loving and attentive parents. I spoke with the doctor that I was working with this morning. He said that there was a chance that there could be some reconstruction that would allow him to still whiz without a catheter. He said that it'll depend heavily upon whether or not there was any internal damage to the area. He is going to talk with our nursing supervisor to see if she has heard any updates on the little one. We were updated 2 days after this incident and were told that he made it through surgery, though we aren't sure what all that entailed. And for anyone who reads this, cherish your kids' lives as much as you can. The doc I was with went through a 3 to 4 year long stint of not being able to have children, thinking that his wife was unable. They finally got through the adoption process, and shortly afterward, she became pregnant. Seeing a man who went through all this trouble just to have kids have to witness this neglect and talk with his kids' ignorant parents just breaks me. It's different to see elderly people with many comorbid conditions pass away, but it's much, much worse to have a young child. Count your blessings, and even if you feel like you are doing a bad job as a parent, husband, wife, just know that you aren't doing that bad. The doctor received another update from the grandfather, who's in his mid-30s. The patient's glands weren't totally missing. A small portion receded, so surgeons were able to pull it back out and reconstruct a new one, though it will not look or feel the same as the one taken from him. He will be able to whiz normally, though, and there is a possibility that he will be able to have kids in the future. Story 18. OR nurse here. This is kind of a long one, too. I was taking a call one night and woke up at 2 in the morning for a quote-unquote general surgery call. Pretty vague, but at the time I lived in a town that had large populations of young military guys and avid users, so late-night emergencies were common. Got to the hospital where a few more details awaited me. Needless to say, our entire crew was less than thrilled. I went down to the emergency room to transport the patient, and the only thing the ER nurse said as she handed me the chart was, "Have fun with this one." Amongst healthcare professionals, vague statements like that are a bad sign. My patient was a 314-pound Native American woman who barely fit on the stretcher I was transporting her on. She was rolling frantically side to side and in pain, pulling at her clothes and muttering Hail Marys. I could barely get her name out of her after a few minutes of questioning, so after I confirmed her identity and what we were looking on, I figured it was best to just get her to the anesthesiologist so we could knock her out and get this circus started. She continued her theatrics the entire 10-minute ride to the OR, nearly falling off the surgical table as we were trying to put her under anesthetic. We see patients like this a lot, though, chronic users who don't handle pain well. who have used so many substances that even increased levels of pain medication don't touch simply because of high tolerance levels. It should be noted, tonight's surgical team was not exactly wet behind the ears. I'd been working in healthcare for several years already, mostly psych and medical settings. I've watched an 88-year-old man tear a 1 diameter catheter balloon out of his Johnson while screaming, "You'll never make me talk." I've seen some things. The other nurse has been in the OR as a trauma specialist for over 10 years. The anesthesiologist had done residency at a level 1 trauma center. The surgeon was ex-Army and averaged about 8 words and 2 facial expressions a week. None of us expected what was about to happen next. So we got the lady off to sleep, put her into the stirrups, and I began washing off the area. It was red and inflamed, but it was all pretty standard. Her chart had noted that she'd been injecting IV substances, so this was obviously an infection from dirty needles or bad substances, but overall, it didn't seem to warrant her repeated cries of, "Oh, Jesus, send me now." The surgeon steps up with the scalpel, sinks just the tip in, and at the exact same moment, the patient had a muscle twitch in her diaphragm, and just like that, all hell broke loose. Unbeknownst to us, the infection had actually tunneled nearly a foot into her abdomen. We all wear waterproof gowns, face masks, gloves, hats, the works, all of which were as helpful as raincoats against a fire hose. The bed was in the middle of the room, an easy 7 feet from the nearest wall, but by the time we were done, I was still finding bits pasted against the back wall. As the surgeon continued to advance his tool, the torrent just continued. I was nearly 12 feet away, jaw dropped open within my surgical mask, watching the second nurse dry heaving, and the surgeon standing on tiptoes to keep this stuff from soaking his socks any further. The smell hit them first. The other nurse was out. She tore off her mask and sprinted out of the room, shoulders still heaving. Then it hit me, mouth still wide open, not able to believe the volume this woman's body contained. It was like getting a great big bite of the despair and apathy that permeated this woman's life. I couldn't breathe. My lungs simply refused to pull any more of that stuff in. The anesthesiologist went down next, an ex-NCAA D1 tailback, his 6'2" frame shaking as he threw open the door to the OR suite in an attempt to get more air in, letting me glimpse the second nurse still wrenching in the sinks outside the door. Another geyser splashed across the front of the surgeon. The YouTube clip of David at the dentist keeps playing in my head. Is this real life? In all operating rooms everywhere in the world, regardless of socialized or privatized, secular or religious, big or small, there is one thing the same. Somewhere there is a bottle of peppermint concentrate. Everyone in the department knows where it is, everyone knows what it's for, and everyone prays to their gods they never have to use it. In times like this, we rub it on the inside of our masks to keep the outside smells at bay long enough to finish the procedure and shower off. I sprinted to our central supply, ripping open the drawer where this vial of ambrosia was kept and was greeted by an empty box. The bottle had been emptied and not replaced. Somewhere out there was a monster who would use the last of the peppermint oil and not replace a single drop of it. To this day, if I figure out who it was, I'm gonna end them with my bare hands just so we're even. So I darted back into the room with the next best thing I could find, a vial of Mastisol, which is an adhesive rub we use sometimes for bandaging. It's not as good as peppermint, but considering that over 1/3 of the floor was now thoroughly coated in what could easily be mistaken for a combination of bovine afterbirth and maple syrup, we were out of options. I started rubbing as much of the Mastisol as I could get on the inside of my mask, just glad to be smelling anything except this. The anesthesiologist grabbed the vial next, dousing the front of his mask in it so he could stand next to his machines long enough to make sure this woman didn't pass away on the table. It wasn't until later that we realized that Mastisol can give you a mild thing from huffing it like this, but in retrospect, that's probably what got us through. By this time, the smell had permeated out of our OR suite and down the 40-foot hallway to the front desk. Our suite looked like the underground river of ooze from Ghostbusters 2, except dirty. Oh, so dirty. I stepped back into the OR suite, not wanting to leave the surgeon by himself in case he genuinely needed help. It was like one of those overly artistic representations of a zombie apocalypse you see on fan forums. Here's this one guy in blue surgical garb, standing nearly ankle deep in dirty stuff. He was performing surgery in the swamps of Dagobah, except the swamps had just come out of this woman and there was no Yoda. He and I didn't say a word for the next 10 minutes as he scraped the inside, the front of his gown, his eyes squinting against the stinging vapors originating directly in front of him. I finished my required paperwork as quickly as I could, helped him stuff the recently vacated opening full of gauze, taped this woman closed to hold the dressing for as long as possible, woke her up, and immediately shipped off to the recovery ward. Until then, I'd only heard of alcohol showers. Turns out 70% isopropyl alcohol is about the only thing that can even touch a scent like that once it's soaked into your skin. It takes 4 or 5 bottles to get really clean, but it is worth it. It's probably the only scenario I can honestly endorse drinking a little of it too. As we left the locker room, the surgeon and I looked at each other, and he said the only negative sentence I heard him utter in 2.5 years of working together. That was bad. The next morning, the entire department, a very large floor within the hospital, still smelled. The housekeepers told me later that it took them nearly an hour to suction up all of the fluid and debris left behind. The OR suite itself was closed off and quarantined for 2 more days just to let the smell finally clear out. I laugh now when I hear recruits to healthcare talk about the worst thing they've seen. You ain't seen anything, kid. Story 19. Hoping I don't get buried. It's hard to gauge, but a few of the top ones are: guy who exsanguinated when a laryngeal tumor that was wrapped around his carotid artery blew. He lasted 24 hours. I was a day nurse and I gave him to a night nurse who I didn't think had the experience to properly handle such a heavy case, but because of stupid politics, I didn't fight it as hard as I should have. The poor patient spent all night without any pain medication because this moronic nurse didn't understand the concept of palliative care. And the worst part was the patient's wife told me he was afraid of red liquid, and he was completely awake and aware of the entire thing. Another guy came to us with Fournier's gangrene. If you're a guy who's easily disturbed, turn back now. The story, which I don't believe at all, is that this guy was a regular mid-50s white male with a job and a house and a girlfriend, and one day he fell down, had to go to rehab. Why? Ended up wheelchair bound. Why? And then was left sitting in his wheelchair for so long, dirty and uncared for. Why? I'm sorry, but this guy was my dad's age, and my dad would not just sit in a wheelchair. No normal, semi-functioning human would. There was another lady who had a surgical wound that became infected. She was a big girl, and after all was said and done, she had a surgery across her entire belly. There was a guy who totaled his Johnson by putting it in some kind of injectable Mexican substance. I didn't get to see that one, but I heard about it. He also had an ostomy, and he had a wife and a girlfriend. Meanwhile, I was single. That's life for you, I guess. There were a lot of sad stories, too. A lot of elderly people put themselves through misery to prolong their lives, almost always with no purpose. Spending the last of their days in a lovely room, being shoved around in a bed by strangers, not being allowed to eat or drink, nauseous and in pain from all the side effects of whatever we're doing to them, all because their kids just can't let go. Lots of cancer. A girl was suffering from cancer whose mom had just passed away of cancer a year prior and was in a foreign country with no family or friends. She passed away alone. A boy I got very close with was on life support for 3 months because his cancer treatment wasn't working. It was a very, very unusual case. He had panic attacks almost every night, couldn't move, couldn't eat. He ended a very long, slow, and painful passing, and I cared about him so much. There was a beautiful girl who rolled over while Dad was listening to music. She was gone when she got to us. We withdrew care several days later. There were dozens of kids born with problems that made caring for them difficult, and parents who dropped them off at the hospital and bailed, like permanently. They come to visit every few weeks and pick up the phone just often enough to tell us they still want custody, but they became the doctors' and nurses' children. I'm taking care of one tonight. She probably doesn't have much longer to live. There was a baby I took care of who was born with severe genetic illnesses. Her mother was still young and was homeless, and then the kid had to have both legs removed to make things worse. The girl was determined to care for her son, though. I don't know what ended up happening to her. My career is hands down the best thing that could have happened to me. It gives me a sense of purpose, and I love being able to be smart and capable and caring at some of the worst times in a person's life. It's tough, though. I wouldn't trade it for anything. Story 20. A few years ago, I was working as a supervisor at a nursing home that had a 30-bed vent unit. It was not a nice facility and was closed by the state a few times while I worked there. Because the management was so terrible and staffing was so short, every admission that came through the door was entirely the responsibility of the supervisor. I was not permitted to delegate any of the admission assessments or work to my CART nurses, probably because they only assigned one nurse to work a 30-bed vet unit. One night I have 7 or 8 admissions due and they all end up coming around the same time, so obviously I have to keep some of them waiting to be assessed. 4 of the 5 admissions were vented patients to our respiratory unit, so it was a super busy night. One of the vented patients who I hadn't gotten around to assessing yet, he'd been there about 2 hours, decannulated himself. The patient was a DNR, so his track was reinserted by my respiratory team and they began bagging the patient to bring his stats back up. Eventually, the guy coded and passed away, and it became evident something was really wrong because he looked all swollen and puffy. Turns out, when they reinserted the track, it didn't go into his trachea, so when they bagged him, it filled all his tissues with air. I called to notify the family of his passing, and they insisted on coming to the facility to see him one last time. I explained that he might look quite different than they remember him and recommended that they not come to see him, but they insisted. So I spent the next 45 minutes massaging air out of this man with 3 other staff members. It didn't help much, and the family was extremely upset. Then I had to do a complete admission on a person who was already gone, then discharge them immediately afterward. Story 21. I guess the most traumatizing for me and everyone involved was a patient who came in after an out-of-hospital arrest. Had been down for a solid hour of CPR, then half an hour with us before regaining spontaneous circulation. We had him on every medication possible to keep him alive. He was intubated but didn't need any sedation. We kept him alive, slowly increasing his meds more and more as they became more useless. His family had been with him the entire time, telling him, "You can do it. I believe in you." They'd been told over and over what the outcome was, but they just couldn't believe it. It was about 4 hours after he arrived when the most horrible thing happened. He was still technically alive, but he had given up. We knew moving him would cause his last bit of life to go, so the family hung around for a bit longer, the smell getting worse and worse until they finally couldn't even stand in the room. We moved him, cleaned him as much as we could. However, during our efforts, he worsened. We just covered what we could with wipes, brought the family in, and they finally let him go. It was rough. I guess another one would be a man that came to us incidentally, was lysed and he passed away on transport, was meant to go past us to a bigger hospital, but he passed away en route. So they stopped at us so we could clean him up and the family could come say goodbye. We spent an hour cleaning him up as best as we could. That was horrifying. If you've ever seen someone with that same case, be thankful, not just the look, but the smell. And if any of these stories got to you, here's more for you. YouTube thinks you're going to love this. Catch you in that video.